May I introduce the Honourable John Faulkner to introduce session 2.
Well, this is a very simple task, but a very pleasurable task. It's simply to introduce my friend Rose Jackson, who is going to moderate this session. And as I'm sure you all know, Rose is a member of the New South Wales Legislative Council, pre-selected for another 8-year term a couple of days ago, is of course also a member of the Shadow Executive there, the Shadow Minister for Water, Housing and Homelessness, and perhaps just as important, a member of the board of the Whitlam Institute. Rose, over to you.
Thank you, John. Absolutely, just as importantly, a member of the board of the Whitlam Institute. So thanks everyone for taking your seats for this second session. It's going to run a little bit like the first. We have with us the incredible Jenny Hocking, who is going to launch her paper, Relevant and Electable. And so she's going to talk for a little bit. Thank you so much, Jenny, for this incredible piece of work. We can't wait to have a discussion about it. And then we'll have a response from Dr. Patrick Mullins to some of the themes and ideas that Jenny's raised, and then we'll have a conversation and we invite you to be part of that conversation too. So as Jenny and Patrick are speaking, feel free to think about some of the themes that they're talking about, any questions you have, any things you disagree with, any different priorities you might identify. We're really keen to have quite an open conversation on this incredibly interesting topic that we're here to talk about today. So make sure your mobile phones are on silent if you happen to not have them on silent during the break. And without further ado, I would like to introduce to launch her paper, Distinguished Whitlam Fellow, Emeritus Professor Jenny Hocking.
Thank you very much, Rose. Thank you to Professor John Durrance and everyone at the Whitlam Institute. As I say in my paper, the longer paper, Gough Whitlam came to Parliament as the new member for Werriwa. It was just 3 years since the last Labor government. He was hopeful of a return to office and never anticipated the 2 decades of opposition that lay before him and the Australian Labor Party. It's a testament to the capacity of the Labor Party to survive through a period of such deep division, and to Whitlam's own determination that together they endured those 2 decades in fractious opposition to form government in 1972 for the first time in 23 years. This paper, that is the longer paper that we're launching today, takes us on that journey from opposition to government, from the electoral despair and party devastation of the bitter post-split years, and rebuilding a party platform that had become irrelevant to contemporary needs, to restore the Labor Party to contemporary relevance, in Whitlam's favourite phrase, or as John Faulkner puts it, to make the Labor Party not just electable, but worth electing. Those 2 words, contemporary relevance, constitute the consistent thread of Whitlam's public life. He called it the overarching principle and a unifying theme to all my work. In this anniversary year, as we examine the beginnings of the Whitlam government, we're reminded again of the depth of policy development that he drove, along with so many others, inside the Liberal Party and outside, and its extensive preparations for the immediate transition to government. And I do want to spend a bit of time later today talking about that rapid transition to government. Apart from anything else, I find it very interesting. The extent of that work of party renewal is simply remarkable. And yet in much of the Whitlam historiography, this pre-government period is strangely overlooked. For too long, we have read the Whitlam government backwards, through the prism of its dismissal. It is a fundamental distortion. The irresistible drama of that singular event with its operatic arc of political promise and dashed hope, has consumed much of the historical focus on the Whitlam government, and in some cases all but eclipsed the years of recovery and renewal which preceded it. And one of the significant features of this period, and particularly so for the year leading into government, is the planning and organisation underpinning it. Now, planning and organisation are not words generally associated with the Whitlam government, I think. And yet, as Governor-General Sir Paul Hasluck noted at the time, planning and foresight were key features of Whitlam's immediate transition to government through the duumvirate, and I'll come back to that later. And so this symposium provides a welcome opportunity for something of a historical corrective by refocusing not on the final months of the Whitlam government and its dramatic denouement, as much of the historiography does, but on how it came to be. This subtle yet significant shift in perspective, one that looks forward towards the government and not back to it, emphasises aspects that are frequently lost in the popular historical narrative of governmental chaos and vice-regal dismissal. And what you can see from that perspective is a rare continuity in Whitlam's political trajectory, which stretches back even to his childhood in Canberra and his youthful political agitations at Sydney University. His commitment to electoral equity, his abhorrence of the pretensions of upper houses, his commitment to Indigenous rights, to women's rights and to equality of opportunity, his concerns for formalised civil and political rights under the auspices of the United Nations were all among his abiding interests. Let me say a few words about that background, because this is where the consistent threads in Whitlam's life began. His childhood in the newly developing national capital and early immersion in that political milieu was a critical influence. His war service, that Frank mentioned, as Air Force navigator in the Pacific, and interactions with Indigenous people at Gove and Yirrkala while he was there, drove a commitment to Indigenous rights and a deep appreciation of the changing political dynamics in the region. In Whitlam's own modest assessment of that, he said, "That gave me an insight which nobody else in the Parliament had so well." And finally, the failure of the Curtin government's 1944 referendum on post-war reconstruction and democratic rights, which Whitlam harboured as unfinished Labor business, bolstered his determination, as he said, to do all I could to modernise the Australian Constitution, and that became another key theme. There's a complex interplay here between Whitlam's own background and experiences, the policy renewal of the 1960s, constitutional innovation, and parliamentary agitation. Whitlam had pursued the Menzies government over many of these issues ever since he arrived in the Parliament. Despite the growing tide of anti-communist sentiment, Whitlam spoke strongly in 1954 in support of recognising communist China. He urged independence for Papua New Guinea and excoriated Menzies for failing to address equal pay for women in the Commonwealth Public Service, or to repeal the discriminatory provisions of Section 127 of the Constitution and address the rights and needs of Indigenous Australians. Labor's electoral desert over this time was twofold. First, its intractable divisions over policy and personalities reflected in and reinforced by the split, the shock and bitterness of which, together with the formation of the fiercely anti-Labor DLP, whose key electoral purpose was to keep the so-called unreconstructed Labor Party from office, caused untold political damage. At the inaugural meeting of the DLP, a Sydney barrister and leading grouper lawyer, John Kerr, was invited to be its first leader. He declined, but he saved his role for another day. And secondly, Labor faced a formidable political and parliamentary foe in Sir Robert Menzies and his UAP Redux creation, the Liberal Party of Australia. Menzies had captured the post-war electoral mood and the need for quiet conservative security, not policy upheaval and division. After the split, Whitlam said the party stagnated and the platform was stultified. Any hope of electoral success became a distant mirage. Essentially, as we talked about also this morning, in Whitlam's view, the Labor Party would remain irrelevant and unelectable unless it developed a modern agenda relevant to the contemporary needs of a broader electoral base. And that's pretty much what he set out to do. He did not see the party platform as some sort of sacred tome which should be impervious to change, but as a reflection of contemporary needs and aspirations of the Australian people, and therefore requiring regular renewal. He expressed this uncomplicated relationship with typical bluntness. Where I disagreed with the platform, I sought to change it. Where I agreed with it, I sought to implement it. But the post-war ascent of the new Liberal Party under Menzies had galvanised the Conservative forces and left Labor struggling to adapt to changing post-war politics. And as the Cold War intensified to these more traditional points of conflict, was added a new and more threatening element in the party's attitude to communism. For Whitlam, the internal party fixation with legacy policies and past versions of itself had rendered Labor electorally unviable, fearful of change, and also unwilling to explore what he came to believe were the constitutional possibilities of reform. The party became obsessed, he said, with the idea that rather than being about renewal for the future, its purpose was to return to a more comfortable past. Not renovation, but mere restoration. And this points to another part in Whitlam's drive for policy reform, without which it simply could not have succeeded. And I see this as extremely important. And that was his intellectual shift from the traditional pessimism of many in the Labor Party who saw the Constitution only as a barrier to reform. And it was a view that had been put most starkly by Whitlam himself in his 1957 lecture, The Constitution versus Labor, which is pretty obvious what his view was. And yet within a few years, he'd revised that view completely. And the reason for that was his membership of the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Constitutional Review. May not sound very exciting, but in the story of the capacity to reform, I think it's absolutely vital. And Whitlam himself described it as one of the key political influences in his time. And it's impossible to overstate that significance. It was intellectually and politically transformative, reframing his view of the constitutional possibilities for reform available to a Labor government. His 4 years on the committee drew him out of the pervasive hopelessness about the Constitution as a barrier, which he had previously described as banning Labor policy, and into a rare optimism instead for its reforming possibilities. He said, "I went from the despair of Section 92 to the confidence of Section 96. 92 was the barrier, 96 was the avenue." And what's more, in terms of the party reform, the Constitution could no longer be used as an alibi, as he described it, for the party's failure to develop a viable, constitutionally compliant reform agenda. And the push for modernisation really accelerated, of course, with Whitlam's election as deputy leader in 1960, with Arthur Calwell as leader, and Frank's terrific paper goes into that period in more detail. And it was an uneasy mix of the old and the new. At 43 years of age, Whitlam was Labor's youngest deputy leader in more than 40 years, Calwell a generation older. Calwell was a dedicated adherent of the White Australia policy, which Whitlam abhorred, and an equally resplendent opponent of state aid for private schools. Whitlam appointed John Menadue, a key figure in the Fabian movement, as his private secretary, and this was one of several appointments that developed into a really strong team around him that proved to be absolutely critical. The invaluable Carol Summerhayes, who is here today, the mainstay in Whitlam's office, his private secretary Richard Hall, the incomparable speechwriter Graham Freudenberg, who later jumped across from Calwell's office in a real statement of just how he saw these waves of change developing. And the head of the Victorian Fabian Society, Race Matthews, came following Menadue's departure. So the Fabian influence became a very important one. It was Menadue who captured the three-step path from party reform to election victory in the pithy catch-cry, party, policy, people. And the Fabian evidence-based approach to policy development suited Whitlam. It suited his belief that I think we also mentioned this morning in the capacity of forensic argument, supported by detailed empirical research, to persuade and also to drive good policy. And it also generated a policy bank of ideas and actions on every policy matter that later proved to be extremely important in that transition to government. Whitlam's use of questions on notice was a key part of this iterative policy development, and his speeches were long, they were packed full of data, facts and figures, assembled with a barrister's intent to make an unassailable argument of the need for reform. And his maiden speech to Parliament in 1953 was an arresting example of this didactic method, and so powerful was it that he was interrupted, which is of course the protocol breach of interrupting a maiden speech. In this protracted process of renewal, 1969 was a pivotal year. This was a high point in policy reform as a raft of new policy commitments was adopted at the 1969 National Conference. But it should be pointed out, of course, that's the end point of a very long process of reform and earlier periods of less significant, I suppose, reform that had been underway for a very long time. The conference passed motions on the Vietnam War, state aid, education and electoral equity, the White Australia policy and Indigenous affairs, and many, many others. A total of 61 resolutions was passed and conference proceedings were televised for the first time, and also, of course, there'd been a significant restructuring of those bodies. 1969 was also the year that Whitlam fought his first election as leader and the first for the Labor Party with this comprehensive reform agenda. In fact, if you look at the two policy speeches, 1969 and 1972, there's really very little substantive difference in matters of policy between them. And Whitlam certainly always saw it that way. He felt that the mandate related as much to the 69 election as the 72. And the result in the October 1969 election was a stunning turnaround in the party's electoral standing and a sharp rebuff for Prime Minister Gorton. Labor gained 18 seats with a 7.1% swing and 50.2% of the two-party preferred vote, falling short of victory by 4 seats. Gorton, already a controversial figure within the Liberal Party, was never secure from that point on and was eventually succeeded by Sir William "Billy" McMahon. Suddenly, the Labor Party appeared a paragon of stability. And the Sydney Morning Herald, in no way a Whitlam supporter or a Labor Party supporter for that matter, suddenly declared Whitlam a certain future Australian Prime Minister. There was, of course, as we also discussed this morning, never anything certain about it, and I think Patrick's going to say a few words about that later. It would always be more difficult for the Labor Party to form government, if only for the fact of a significant rural gerrymander. I think Anthony Whitlam raised that this morning, and I agree totally that the gerrymander was significant and shouldn't be forgotten. The rural weighting, as it was politely called, gifted the coalition electorates in rural areas with as few as of half the voter population of inner city Labor seats. For its great beneficiary, the Country Party, it was the electoral equivalent of 2 for the price of 1. And of course, the age was still 21, the voting age at that time, and that made a difference as well. You didn't have the benefit of a youth vote. Despite these structural obstacles, a discernible shift in the public reception of Whitlam and the Labor Party was already underway, particularly after Whitlam's historic visit to China in 1971. Whitlam's decision to head an ALP delegation to Communist China was audacious, politically fraught, and personally exhilarating. Despite Freudenberg urging caution, saying there's an election only a year away, you're courting disaster to appear soft on communism, Whitlam was always going to go. He started packing at once. This was an opportunity to enter the world stage at a tipping point in international relations, which Whitlam had discerned, and importantly, McMahon had not. Or if he had discerned it, he certainly wasn't able to act on it. As Whitlam met Premier Zhou Enlai to intense international media interest, McMahon mocked him as the Manchurian candidate. I think we saw that term recycled fairly recently, which show it's not only offensive, it's completely unoriginal. Accusing him of impertinence to our great ally, the United States of America. Well, unfortunately for McMahon, our great ally hadn't even bothered to tell the Australian Prime Minister of a tectonic shift in US-China relations, which was then underway. McMahon learnt too late that the US Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, was arriving in Beijing to arrange President Nixon's own trip to China just as Whitlam was leaving. It was a triumph for Whitlam and a complete humiliation for McMahon. Whitlam returned to Australia as the harbinger of change, with the McMahon government looking increasingly jaded and out of touch. It marked a turning point for Labor, from being seen as the party of opposition to a viable party of government, which was already driving the policy agenda from opposition. And in the longer paper, I talk about 3 episodes in particular, which I think exemplify this early point in Labor's transition to government, as Labor stepped into the policy void that had been created by this inertia in coalition policy development. So the position of the two parties has, in a fascinating way, almost changed 180 degrees from the previous decade. The second of these I'll mention briefly is the leader's response to the Aboriginal Tent Embassy, which had been established on the lawns opposite Parliament House on the 26th of January 1972, after McMahon had chosen that extraordinarily provocative day to announce the rejection of calls for the recognition of Aboriginal land rights. Whitlam was the only parliamentary leader to visit the Aboriginal Tent Embassy and speak to its members. He met with embassy leaders and members soon after it opened, and he committed a Labor government to ending the Menzies era policy in Indigenous affairs in favour of self-determination and a recognition of land rights. McMahon's refusal even to engage with the embassy members and insistence that the tent embassy be torn down only cemented the view that the coalition government was out of step and out of time. And the images of the police really brutally tearing down the tents on more than one occasion and arresting protesters and embassy members, some of them with serious injuries, were absolutely shocking and shown all around the world. It was an extremely low point in Indigenous relations. And it presaged an electoral defeat for the McMahon government in the federal election on the 2nd of December 1972. I'll say a few words about the campaign, which was the most professional political campaign the Labor Party had ever run. Like the Fabian-style approach to policy development which underpinned it and preceded it, it drew on extensive research and detailed planning, using focus groups for the first time in an election campaign, and even road testing a mini campaign before the main event to test the reception of the leaders, their wives and individual policies in the electorate. Even Whitlam's new fluffy hairstyle that he gained after going to China was tested with the electorate and found to be very positive. It was actually because he'd run out of brill cream. But that didn't matter, it stayed. And so did Margaret. Margaret, as we said this morning, was very popular in the electorate, and her role was then bumped up, and I give credit to Murray Goot's wonderful work in this area for analysing these in much more detail. But nothing was left to chance, and that's really important to remember, and it's because of this hesitation and uncertainty about the result. Whitlam never took anything for granted, absolutely not. The campaign was thematically linked across all media, and its most identifiable element, an anthemic campaign theme song, It's Time, featuring prominent identities in the arts and television, including Patricia Amphlett, who is here today, of course, and it perfectly captured the electoral mood for change and of optimism. And it worked. How many other campaign slogans and campaign songs are still remembered with such affection, even 50 years later? I'd say none. Whitlam's It's Time policy speech, delivered on 13th of November 1972 in the Blacktown Civic Centre, was the culmination of the policy work of the previous decade. It presented a sweeping reform agenda with over 120 individual commitments. Some say 200, you just take your pick between, synthesised into an expansive blueprint for modern Australia known as the program. He acknowledged the breadth of these commitments after 23 years of Conservative government. It has to be so. It should be so, because the backlog is so great. Its three great aims were to promote equality, to involve the people of Australia in the decision-making processes of our land, and to liberate the talents and uplift the horizons of the Australian people. And at its heart was equality of opportunity. And for Whitlam, the key to opportunity was education, based on a student's merit rather than a parent's wealth. In contrast to this aspirational pitch, Prime Minister McMahon delivered an anodyne speech from behind a studio desk. With polling still tight and an unlikely victory for the coalition possible, McMahon resorted to the tired electoral tropes of Labor as soft on communism and soft on unions and strikes. It was in every way reactive, not proactive. Labor's catchy "It's time" slogan was everything that the Liberal Party's prosaic response, "not yet," was not, which was only made worse by coalition advertisements showing Whitlam taking off a mask to reveal Bob Hawke. Labor responded with advertisements showing Billy McMahon taking off a mask to reveal Billy McMahon. And I think it was Mick Young who at one point said to Whitlam, "Look, go easy on the little fella, people are starting to feel sorry for him." And, you know, it is a cruelty of that campaign. Patrick might like to say a few words about that, but Whitlam absolutely overpowered McMahon in every way. And it was quite sad to see that there was no comeback for that. And on the 2nd of December 1972, Whitlam led the Australian Labor Party to victory for the first time in 23 years with 52.7% of the vote, and a relatively small but very comfortable swing of 2.5%. What I talk about next briefly, because I'm probably too long, is Whitlam's notion of the mandate, which I see as critical, and he clearly did as well. He saw the election result as a compact. He called it a mandate for change between the party and the electorate. And the strict implementation of the program was therefore the political imperative of the election outcome. He said this in his very first speech after the election from the Albert Street backyard in Cabramatta. The government will have a mandate from the people to carry out all its programs. The word mandate is there, and it's in many, many speeches and the Governor-General's opening address that following year. Whitlam's notion of the mandate is critical to understanding his approach to government and why he moved so quickly. And at the heart of it was the program, and he intended to begin at once. When it's understood as the culmination of years of intensive policy development and party renewal in this way, there should be no surprise at all at the immediacy and speed of change in the first weeks of the Whitlam government. And yet one of the persistent critical refrains about the government is that it did too much too soon. We might well ask, how much is too much? And how soon is too soon? Is 23 years in opposition really still too soon for a Labor Party not only to take office, but to do what it said it would do once there? Perhaps the most remarkable thing about this fatuous claim is its persistence. And Brian Toohey commented on this actually in a very good article and a withering assessment only last month, saying the idea that Whitlam tried to do too much has been used since as an excuse to do too little. So what you might call the inanity of too much too soon, seen in this light, serves a political function, not a descriptive one, as a political caution for others against reform, which thankfully Whitlam did not adhere to. And the day after the election, he took his first VIP flight as Prime Minister-elect to Canberra. He met with key departmental secretaries to begin the process of government at once. And that process drew heavily on a really impressive transition to government document, which is there in the archives, drawn up by Whitlam's principal private secretary, Peter Walensky. And it set out the most extensive reorganisation of the public service in decades. But there's another continuity in this rapid transition to government. It's the detailed method of Fabian policy development that began with the Labor Party in opposition, with its deeply embedded research, and which now formed the basis for immediate action in government. I think The Schools Commission is one, contained in the policy, referred to in an interim capacity of the duumvirate. And Bunting's papers, Sir John Bunting's, they're not the most fascinating papers I've seen in the archives, but for this few weeks of transition, they're absolutely fascinating. And it shows the direct connection between the revised Labor Party platform. There's even a copy of the 1971 ALP platform in Bunting's papers. Here was the practical expression of the mandate and the final point of the years of the policy renewal. Whitlam now faced a uniquely Labor problem, and that was the problem of how to appoint the ministry when votes were still being counted. It would last potentially another 10 days. McMahon, in the meantime, believed that he would continue as Prime Minister until the full ministry had been decided, and he put that to the Governor-General Hasluck at a meeting on the 5th of December. Whitlam arrived for his own meeting soon after, and he put forward a novel proposal that he form government as a duumvirate, with his deputy Lance Barnard taking all 27 ministries between them. And again, Hasluck in the archives, he has a wonderful set of pen portraits. He was a wonderful journalist before he went into Parliament. And he wrote this scintillating coverage of this extraordinarily significant series of conversations between him and Whitlam and him and McMahon as government was just being formed. And he wrote, "It became apparent that some weeks before polling day, Whitlam had worked out in his own mind the expedient of having an interim government of 2 ministers, and that he had planned the sequence of immediate action to be taken." And I just thought that was extraordinary, that he's even thinking ahead to the fact that he might need to continue to form an interim government, which of course is what Albanese did more recently. And Hasluck agreed, and on the 5th of December, Whitlam was sworn in as Australia's 21st Prime Minister and Lance Barnard as Deputy Prime Minister, and all 27 ministries. Whitlam always said, well, I very generously only took 13, Barnard took 14. And they then made decisions that, of course, didn't require parliamentary oversight. 40 key decisions in an action-packed 2 weeks. The immediate release of young men from prison for refusing to serve in the Vietnam War was the first. Men in prison for refusing to go to war. And there were something like 300 other prosecutions pending, which were all dropped. The end of conscription, the withdrawal of remaining forces from Vietnam, changing Australia's votes at the United Nations on self-determination and sanctions against apartheid, excluding racially selected sporting teams, closing the Rhodesian Information Centre, recognising China, removing ACT sales tax on the contraceptive bill, reopening the equal pay case, which the McMahon government had opposed, and appointing a young Sydney barrister, Mary Gaudron, to lead it, announcing a search for an Australian national anthem and an Australian system of honours, an interim schools commission to determine needs-based funding, and a royal commission into Aboriginal land rights in the Northern Territory are just a few. Even the usually dour Sir John Bunting kept a detailed record of this unique first ministry, as he described it, for future historians. And how grateful was I, because it's a wonderful collection, including all of the media clippings. And it's a clear recognition that Bunting was aware of its wonderful historic political significance. And every one of those 40 decisions was based on a clear policy commitment in the ALP platform and the policy speech. Graham Freudenberg called it the apotheosis of the mandate. In those 2 weeks, the familiar landscape of post-war Australian politics had changed irrevocably. And the Whitlam government, which would be the most reformist government in our history, had only just begun. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And now we will hear a response from Dr. Patrick Mullins.
In May 1972, the editor of the Melbourne Age lunched with Prime Minister Billy McMahon. It was, it seems, a rather surreal meal. Describing McMahon as rather dazzling company, Graham Perkin was nonetheless beggared by McMahon's summation of the political scene and its likely future. "The funny little man," Perkin wrote to a colleague, "has convinced himself that he is a brilliant success, and he sees himself winning handsomely in November and remaking the nation in the following 3 years, leading them, the coalition, to victory in 1975, and then retiring with honours thick upon him. God save us all. To those looking with the benefit of hindsight or the gilt-edged lens of myth, this seems preposterous. We're all familiar with summations of the McMahon government. Tired, divided, incompetent, more than a little silly, more than a little embarrassing. In this telling, as Michelle has said this morning, this government was inevitably on the way out. It was always going to lose. Moreover, this government, in this telling, did nothing of consequence between 1969 and 72, and the election of Gough Whitlam was never in question. As Jenny has just said of the Whitlam government, the end so often defines our understanding of the McMahon government as well. This regard has two insidious effects. The first is to diminish the very genuine achievement of the Labor Party's election in 1972, in putting behind it a generation of division, a generation in which defeat turned voters wholly against it. Another is to render the pre-1972 years as a shapeless interregnum between the going of Menzies and the coming of Gough, this kind of Antipodean dark ages where nothing of import happened. Understanding the significance of Labor's victory in 1972 and the world it confronted upon taking office requires us to dispel both of these and involves some scrutiny of the Liberal coalition government between 69 and 72. Whitlam himself, I hazard, would agree, for he was always insistent that 1972 was a live contest, even against a Prime Minister as underwhelming as Billy McMahon. Whitlam argued that as Prime Minister, McMahon had tried to bestride two horses. He claimed to be the real heir to Menzies, yet he also claimed to recognise and accept the need for change in a changing world. This balancing act, Whitlam wrote, McMahon did with some skill. Some does a lot of work in that. But this balancing act is one really useful way, I think, of understanding the government's actions between 69 and 72, and indeed of seeing how it tried, under John Gorton and then under Billy McMahon, to manoeuvre itself into a position where another election victory, a 10th election victory, might have been possible. Now, at a distance, the events that followed the 1969 election are confounding. The leader of the victorious party was immediately subjected to a leadership challenge. But 1969, as Jenny has said, and as Michelle and Frank have both said too, was a landmark moment, especially for the coalition. A swing that manifested in the loss of 16 seats, it was, in the eyes of some, confirmation of the waning fortunes of Prime Minister John Gorton. Gorton's 1968 elevation to the Prime Ministership, after the death of Harold Holt, had been spurred by two things, two beliefs. One, that he had the good, cool political judgment. Two, that he could perform on TV. The 2 years that had followed had brought both of these into question. Gorton's ambivalence toward colleagues and his tendency toward unilateralism had antagonised many within the government, and notwithstanding a strong start, his abilities as a public speaker deserted him. Whitlam, for example, would quote Gorton, these mangled, tortured sentences, this awful kind of car crash of syntax, and then say, well, now, ladies and gentlemen, it's clear. We all understand, don't we? Amid these personal indictments, however, were more serious political disagreements and policy disagreements about how far, if at all, the government should move to address the issues that were, after 20 years in office, now besetting it. During the 1969 campaign, Gorton had gestured toward traditional coalition strengths, while simultaneously gesturing toward new horizons. Alongside hawkish statements on defence and national security and income tax cuts, he talked about increasing spending on education, about starting an Australian film school, about reforms in healthcare. But his statements about defence did little to assuage suspicious hardliners within his own party and within the Democratic Labor Party. Nor did his moves to withdraw Australian troops from Vietnam mollify the protesters who would soon take to the streets in successive moratorium marches. Gorton's domestic policies, many of which centred on an empowered Commonwealth reaching into matters traditionally the purview of the state governments, antagonised state premiers, particularly those of his own party, and colleagues whose fidelity to federalism was a matter of faith. All this fed into the challenge launched 2 weeks after the election. But while National Development Minister David Fairbairn and Treasurer Billy McMahon failed, the fissures that their challenge exposed within the party would not close over. A ministerial reshuffle to blood a younger generation of MPs, including Malcolm Fraser, Billy Snedden and Andrew Peacock, only spurred suggestions of cronyism. Backbenchers attacked government legislation in the privacy of the party room and then in the public spaces of the House and the Senate. A poor showing at the half-Senate election late in 1970 was followed by a party room motion for Gorton's resignation. Then a murky series of press reports in March 1971 spurred Fraser to resign and savage Gorton in the House. This led to Gorton's resignation as Prime Minister, the elevation of Billy McMahon, and farcically, Gorton's immediate, if short-lived, election to the deputy leadership of the Liberal Party. The bitter division engendered by these moves lingered. Trust was non-existent, whispers of further leadership spills continued, and policy disagreements were so pronounced that the breakup of the coalition was even broached. In McMahon, the government had a leader who had done much to sow this division, and who in office would continue to seed more. Simultaneously, in McMahon, it had a politician with 20 years of experience at the highest levels of government, who was willing to do all he could to stay there. In service to this, Governor-General Paul Hasluck remarked, McMahon would not be cumbered either by ideals or principles. We can observe this, I think, in McMahon's shifting and tacking on the question of China. As a relatively low minister in the 1950s, McMahon had argued that the People's Republic would have to remain on the periphery of the international community until it had renounced violence. As Minister for External Affairs in 1970, while initiating and overseeing a review of Australia's relationship with China, with the PRC pressing a claim to enter the UN, he agreed that things had to change, but simultaneously insisted on putting conditions and caveats about that change. His view was oriented more by domestic political circumstance than any kind of strategic or moral factor. Remember, please, that we have a DLP, he told his department, and its reaction must be considered. Accompanying this, he sent a compilation of press clippings to the department, every single hawkish statement expressed by the DLP on China. Get the message, basically. By the time the Gorton cabinet reviewed its relationship with the PRC in February 1971, its resolution was similarly timid. It accepted that the PRC was engaging with the international community and that Australia would have to reappraise its relationship, but that it would, for the moment, follow the lead of the United States. The consequences of this hesitant ambivalence began to play out almost immediately. In April, McMahon, already Prime Minister by this time for a month, when Whitlam sought an invitation to visit China, McMahon attacked him on grounds of naivety for engaging with this government that had not yet renounced violence. Then, when Whitlam's invitation to visit was granted in May, McMahon announced that his government would explore the possibilities of establishing a dialogue with the PRC. In the space of a month, he had put his government astride 2 horses, of opposition and of engagement. He believed the government to be riding high on these horses when Whitlam visited China in July. Criticising the Labor leader for his instant coffee diplomacy, McMahon told a gathering of Liberal Party members that China has been a political asset to the Liberal Party and will continue to be so in the future. Little did he know how short-lived that future was, with Henry Kissinger already in the air to arrange an American rapprochement. In the wake of Whitlam's visit and US President Richard Nixon's announcement that he would visit China the following year, McMahon privately admitted that his government had failed on China. He was all too aware that Whitlam had won considerable plaudits for his action and that he had looked like a fool, or a stunned mullet, as Lance Barnard called him. Yet he continued to try to bring these 2 horses back together. McMahon explored accompanying Nixon to China on this visit. He tried to find a halfway point between non-engagement and the diplomatic recognition that Whitlam was offering by talking about cultural exchanges. Rebuffed by China on this point, McMahon was then rebuked by DLP leader Vince Gare, who suggested scornfully that McMahon and Whitlam were both trying to engage in a popularity contest on who was more ahead of China. McMahon, in turn, then refused an invitation for Army Minister Andrew Peacock to visit China as part of an unofficial business party. When the PRC was admitted to the UN General Assembly and took a seat on the Security Council late in 1971, McMahon's attempt to bestride the two horses finally came to an end. The paths had diverged. Resigning from engagement with China was no longer an option, and yet China would not accept anything less than diplomatic recognition. The horses had bolted. McMahon was flat on his face. Another example of McMahon's attempted balancing act emerged at the same time, when he apparently made clear to a cabinet committee his support for applications from Aboriginal communities in the Northern Territory for leases on consolidated lands, provided they could satisfy criteria related to their association with the land. Had this been translated into government policy, it would have been an acknowledgement that a traditional association with the lands could perform a basis for land rights claims. However, this view was divergent from the Cabinet Committee members tasked with considering the matter, and McMahon's inconstancy on this did little to bring them to his view, with the effect that the Cabinet Committee took no notice of it when it came to its decision late in 1971 about the government's approach toward Indigenous issues. Thus, the following January, when McMahon issued a statement on government policy for Indigenous Australians, his statement featured a glaring hole. Though the new objectives he announced would guide Indigenous policy formulation were laudable, I think, they were overshadowed by the government's failure on land rights. McMahon ruled out a traditional association with the land as a basis for claims, as doing so would introduce, quote, a new, probably confusing component, the implications of which could not be clearly foreseen. That is, we don't know what's going to happen and we're scared of what might, so no. The attempt to simultaneously hew to a conservative course and agree to change objectives of government policy for Indigenous Australians fell flat, and was hardly helped by issuing this on a day known among Indigenous peoples as one of mourning. It spurred what was one of the most striking images of that year: 4 young men sitting beneath an umbrella on the lawns outside Parliament House, the sun rising behind them, a sign strung up beside them, Aboriginal Embassy. Failures like this left that government precariously poised, yet at other times the attempt to balance change with conservatism bore fruit. The government continued to liberalise censorship policies, notwithstanding the controversies around Portnoy's complaint and the Little Red School Book, but it did nothing to actually change the law itself. It resiled from passing a wholly new Trade Practices Act, though it did try to pass legislation preventing foreign takeovers. It withdrew the last Australian combat troops from Vietnam, yet it left 128 members of the Australian Army training team in the country, and did nothing to end conscription. It joined the Five Powers Defence Arrangements and the OECD. It passed the Childcare Act, which provided Commonwealth intervention in the childcare sector to transform it into a profession supported by research and grants. It increased education spending and scholarship places. It adopted the polluter pays principle for environmental protection. It also tried to get into urban and regional development policy. This was, in large part, response to Whitlam's well-established policy interest in this area, but also came in response to a public demand for Commonwealth action. Meeting that demand required the government to overcome its long-standing aversion to Commonwealth intervention in state responsibilities. As Housing Minister Kevin Cairns argued in March 1972, the first priority had to be to seek agreement at all levels that an urban policy is needed, not to actually devise a policy, just to agree that we might do one. McMahon pushed both for that agreement as well as a policy. He reserved the major policy initiatives to state responsibilities to himself and his department, and then in September, pushed Cabinet to create the National Urban and Regional Development Authority to foster a better balance of population distribution and regional development in Australia. McMahon stressed the significance of the change that was now manifest. It marks our recognition that there is a direct contribution that the Commonwealth Government can make in national urban and regional development. It also, in his eyes, showed that the government had a response, had an answer to Labor's policy in this area. We should be able to tell people where we stand and where we are heading, McMahon wrote in August 1971. And here, I think, captured in a phrase, is the government's position, the government's approach. Stasis and movement. When McMahon went to Government House in November 1972 to seek a dissolution, he felt sufficiently confident that this would be enough to see the government returned. He expressed complete confidence in victory, Hasluck wrote. McMahon was in the end wrong. The government lost. Not by much. As we heard this morning, it's a pretty narrow margin. Around 2,000 votes spread in just the right way would have seen the government cling on to office. And McMahon's forecaster Perkin, God save us, vindicated. How to account for the size of the swing against the government is a matter for argument, as we've heard. But I would suggest that the government's balancing act, alongside a sizable electoral malapportionment, had something to do with it. I don't think I'd be alone to suggest this either. Whitlam later wrote, without McMahon's skill, tenacity and resourcefulness, the ALP's victory in 1972 would have been more convincing than it was. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Patrick. So we're now going to have a bit of a discussion about Jenny and Patrick's really interesting and thoughtful contributions. I might sort of kick off with a couple of questions that I've sort of jotted down in my many notes, but very open to questions and feedback from the floor. I've facilitated many a political panel in my time, and so I know that when you say questions, contributions don't always have to end with a question mark. Sometimes people have just feedback or things that they want to say, which is very welcome. And we might sort of ask the panellists to reflect on those themes. But of course, if there was something that you wanted to say, perhaps just being mindful of keeping it brief in case there are others who want to contribute as well. But I might start off, Jenny. One of the things that you wrote in the longer version of your paper was you described the greatest success of Whitlam as opposition leader was the transformation of the party. That was the phrase that you used. And I just wondered, in the essay and in your speech, you touched on the sort of various elements of that transformation. And I wondered if you thought that there was one that was more important or more significant than others. I've noted 3 elements of transformation myself. One was obviously the policy platform, which you've talked about, the specific changes in policy positions in the platform. One was the culture, as you say, jettisoning that culture of failure, the philosophy of failure that so many sort of Labor people had internalised during that period. And the third, it was the specific undemocratic structures of the party, the actual structural change that he drove within the Labor Party. So those are 3 different transformations. Did you have a view on, they're all linked, I accept, but was one of them, really more significant than others, or how did they interlink within each other?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Look, I suppose they're seen as so closely linked that it's very hard to separate them out, because there'd be a view that, could the policies have been implemented through the structures and the committees if the structures had not at the same time been under such stress, not necessarily be being changed at exactly the same time, but certainly working towards both of those things. And I guess I come back to this less commonly remembered idea of the significance of Whitlam's own shift in his thinking about whether reform was possible, and that is legally possible through perhaps a more expansive way of looking at tied grants, but also in use of international agreements and so on. Because I think that created an optimism, initially just in him, but I think he was able to persuade others of a more optimistic frame of mind, and that was tremendously important. So I probably wouldn't pick between the policies and the structural reforms, because they were others will have other views. And very much I think things changed so dramatically after 1969, and that was both because, you had a really significant number of new MPs coming in, and a vast number of them, somewhere between a third and a half, I think, had professional backgrounds, were professional people. The makeup of the party was changing. The makeup of the MPs coming in were changing. They didn't have the baggage of previous fights. And what's more important is that after 1969, the group remaining in the parliament from those older days could see a possibility of victory. And that's a wonderful unifier. So, some of the remaining divisions there were still some very big divisions still to play out in Victoria. But, I think so many things turned on that, on that success in 69. But it represented this really strong and so hard-fought series of changes within the party.
Yes. I mean, it's interesting you make that point because, when I first entered Parliament and I asked a couple of colleagues from the sort of Rudd-Gillard era in the federal parliament, God, it was pretty difficult and, sort of what works to keep things together. And they said nothing works except doing well.
Yeah,
exactly. There's no culture or structure or policy or anything that keeps people together. The only thing that delivers unity is a sense of winning and a sense that winning is possible. So I think that's just...
And that's absolutely right. And I'll just say one more thing. I remember interviewing Clyde Holding, actually, when I wrote the biography of Whitlam many years ago, and he honed in on that sense of optimism. And it really struck me how important he still, decades later, found that he was obviously used to going to meetings and feeling, this is hopeless. And he said suddenly he felt that things could change and and it's sort of infectious because it's a natural human emotion. You want to feel optimism about politics. It's not all straight lines. It's never going to be straight lines, but you can get there. And so part and parcel with these reforms and changes is that, and it goes together with the success of the changes, is a growing sense of optimism.
I might just ask next, perhaps, to Patrick and yourself, one of the things that you both discussed in your presentations and has already been a bit of a theme is, challenging this idea of the inevitability of the Whitlam government and the inevitability of change in Australia, challenging this idea that sort of Whitlam somehow just rode a wave, that he had no force in contributing to. It's very clear that that's not an accurate representation of what happened at that time. He was, in fact, an incredible driving force of that change, not merely a beneficiary of it. And the example of China and his foresight specifically on China of that, in that it wasn't just luck that he happened to decide, I think I might go to China, and then immediately after Kissinger arrives and signals that, in fact, the entire world is moving in that direction. He had, for many years, seen and foreseen that change coming. In fact, the decision to go was a very considered one. It had met opposition, as you say, even, within his own ranks. He had challenged that. He had forged ahead. He was vindicated by Kissinger's arrival as he departs, but that wasn't, the specific timing may have been a bit fortuitous, but he had in fact, he wasn't just lucky in making that decision. He knew that that was the direction that the world was heading. I wonder, Patrick, if you had any views on that.
I think it's obvious that Whitlam made a considerable part of his own luck. One of the things that strikes when you look at all of the documentation around the China-Australia relationship is the number of times that Australia was blind to what was happening. Even the moment the Gorton government decided that it would reappraise Australia's relationship with China and follow the lead of the United States, it completely kind of wrote off news that the highest levels of American government had had a meeting about their relationship with China, hadn't bothered to ask Australia's input, hadn't bothered to let them know. They just kind of let that go by. And so, of course, McMahon and his government reaped what they sowed. They were just completely blind to it. Whitlam had read that, and he was, I think, as I say, making his own luck. It is worth saying, in that tiny, tiny bit between Whitlam's visit and the announcement that Kissinger had been there, the Liberals were absolutely ecstatic. Malcolm Fraser is recorded saying the government should go to an immediate election because they would be certainly returned to office because of this incident. So it speaks to how fast and how dramatic that moment was.
Yeah, I'll just say that, McMahon's position on it had been tremendously damaging in terms of trade and wheat sales, and the Chinese had made that very clear and said that that McMahon's comments on China had fed into that. So, Whitlam picked up on the changes. I think the wheat market then was sent to Canada, which was, of course, on the cusp of, or had already recognised China. So, yes, Whitlam, his reading was so voracious, his knowledge of international affairs, which is reflected in that meeting with Zhou Enlai so exceptionally. People were just astonished at the breadth and depth of their nearly 2-hour conversation. So, he's aware of the shifting international dimensions, whereas McMahon, as Patrick said, it's not necessarily that he wasn't aware of them, but he couldn't act on it because of the various constraints. But the idea of sort of outsourcing the policy on some of these to the DLP is absolutely extraordinary. I didn't realise it was quite that direct.
Just sort of feel free, by the way, to sort of, signal if you do want to ask a question or make a contribution. Otherwise, I'm happy to just keep asking questions from some of the notes that I've made. Yes, there's someone up the back. Great, we'll mix it up a bit. Please make sure you use the microphone and just introduce yourself.
I will.
Thank you.
I will. I think we need to distinguish pretty carefully between the kinds of things which are happening in what we now call the political class and the kinds of thinking which is happening in the mass electorate. Fraser's idea of going to an election based on Whitlam's visit makes all sorts of assumptions about people understanding what's happened, having a particular view about it, making it a priority issue and so on. Each of these assumptions are completely implausible. They weren't tested, so we'll leave that hanging. But in Jenny's paper, she's arguing that Whitlam was claiming a mandate on the basis of having gone to the electorate with a considerable range of policies and being elected on the basis of these policies. Now, that particular claim is not unique to Whitlam. It's a long tradition in parliamentary democracies where you can claim a mandate on the basis that this is something that you took to the people. You can't claim a mandate for things that you didn't take to the people. But the question arises in the case of Whitlam. What kind of mandate can be claimed in a situation where it's clear from independent evidence which is now very recent in parliamentary democracies, namely survey research, that most people either didn't know about the policies or didn't understand the policies or didn't vote on the basis of these policies? That's a disjuncture which I think needs an explanation.
Yeah, thanks, Murray. That's fantastic. Look, the mandate I find fascinating because Whitlam was so determined about it and so strong about it. And yes, you're right, he used this as part of his argument that we have a very comprehensive program and we're going to put it in place as best we can in the face of the most extreme parliamentary obstruction ever seen in this country. And so in that context, he got an extraordinary amount through the parliament, a record number of bills, in fact. Whitlam estimates about 2/3 of the program, or the bills that went up, were actually, in the end, successful. So I think the difference is that Whitlam, in my view anyway, has a slightly more sophisticated idea and understanding of the mandate than what's often expressed as a matter of simple arithmetic. Do you get the votes? Do you get the number of seats? You're in government, you've got a mandate. And that's why the program and the policy speech and the articulation of it through hundreds and hundreds of meetings over the previous, 6, 7, 8 years is all important, and why he does often refer to the fact that the mandate had been generated as much in 1969, even though he didn't win, but because the policy programs in both speeches were so similar. And he does take that in an almost philosophical way about more like political philosophy in terms of authority and legitimacy. So it's much more, in some ways, it's a more complex notion of the mandate as one that gives authority to do particular things rather than simply getting the numbers to do them, in which case you could have a scenario where very little is put to the electorate, and there's been many criticisms that that's the case at the moment. I happen to disagree with that, but a view that, you could claim a mandate even without having put your program fully to the people. And of course you can. I mean, the electoral reality is you can. But I think Whitlam tried to give it some substance by this constant reference back to the policy speech and the program and how that had been developed over time. And there's no doubt he saw it as absolutely critical. If you look at those initial speeches, all the way through to those first 6 to 7 weeks, right up to the Governor-General's opening speech in Parliament, the reference to the mandate is in every single one of them.
We might go Kim, and then I think Eric Sidoti had his hand up as well.
To read Murray's proposition down, that requires that one is constantly surveying the public in order to have approval for parliamentary action, which I would think is an utterly preposterous notion. Moreover, to put Whitlam's policy announcements in context, there weren't just the 2 election speeches, there were a whole series of policy announcements which were major events in and of themselves, and between 69 and 72, there were at least 3 major statements that were little mini election campaigns, which Jenny referred to in terms of registering the policies and testing the policies, but they were very real announcements of real policy. To say that that is insufficient in terms of claiming an electoral mandate under a democratic system, which is built on having a majority of seats in the House of Representatives and requires some kind of supernormal testing process to be regularly refreshed from public opinion, is, I suggest, patently unworkable and frankly quite absurd.
We'll try. This is good. We like discussion. So feel free, reflections from Patrick and Jenny, or we can go to Eric as well. Reflections. Welcome from the panel.
Yes, look, I must admit, I do agree, Kim. I think, I think the politicians in that sense coming into an election campaign and government have a best case scenario of actually putting a full program to the people. However, I would also say that once they're in, you'd be looking at a sort of form of, I suppose, deliberative democracy almost, where people are pushing buzzers of immediate citizen referenda. Yeah.
I'll speak loud.
Hold on. No, we want discussion, we want debate, we can pause. Okay. We'll get a brief contribution, then back here, then we are going to you, Eric.
Yep. There is a difference between saying we were elected and we took these policies to the people and we are now in government and will implement them. That's one thing. But to say we were elected on the basis of these policies when there's independent evidence, as there is now, that is not the case, is a completely different proposition.
Well, I take your point, Murray, but I think it's what we've got, and I don't mean that disrespectfully. What I mean is that all a political party can do is put its program to the people and be open and honest about that. And I repeat that Whitlam felt very, very strongly about this. And you're right, that did lead to a view politically that claiming a mandate for each and every individual policy was untenable. And certainly it was one of the things that Reg Withers pursued only a few weeks later when he said that Whitlam's claim to have a mandate for every one of his policies was dishonest. He called it dishonest for I suppose, much the same reason that he argued you couldn't claim a mandate. Well, I'm not sure what you can claim a mandate for, if not for a program that has been clearly articulated over the previous few years and put to the Australian people. And it's one of the reasons I included a couple of photos from that sort of otherwise barren period in opposition where endless meetings, endless talks, endless speeches. And there's a wonderful photo of Margaret inspecting a meat tray, one of the many wonderful, exciting things that she had to do while Whitlam was speaking at a meeting. But, you know, there were just endless ones like that, and it was to try and bring the people with them, this conversation with the electorate. But yes, you're right, others will contest that notion of a mandate on a very fine-grained level.
And there is the flip side of that, which is we're now seeing in an age of opinion polling, which we are stuck with, Kim, where the government is wondering whether it should, having gone to the people and saying and having pledged no tax increases, and that we'll keep the stage 3 tax cuts. There is now polling being done and being taken notice of in the parliamentary parties about would people be happy if you dumped those, or would they hold you to account for dumping them?
And you know what, they'd hold you to account. And I think this may be a controversial
That's an empirical
view.
question.
That's
It
right.
doesn't
We're
follow
going to
automatically.
move on.
It's
I
an
think
excellent
Eric was
question.
next, and then we might go over here and then to Bruce.
One of the things that occurred to me over the years, in fact, about Whitlam Labor was its success in my view, its success as a parliamentary opposition, which we probably don't really consider all that often. So I'd just be interested, it seemed to me, Patrick, that your presentation hinted at that in terms of the pressure that McMahon was under in some ways to change. So I'd just be interested in your views.
Yeah, one of the things that is particularly noticeable when you look at the Hansards is the way in which the government is just so reactive. Every single thing that Labor puts forward a policy on, the government is actuated constantly by this need to have a reply. And if I can be a bit superficial, a great example is Whitlam goes to China, forgets his Brill cream, comes back with fluffy hair. McMahon, who previously oils his hair, stops oiling his hair. And that, I think, feeds into one of these images of the government being somewhat incompetent and perhaps too being behind the times, that it's constantly lagging and in hoc to attitudes that the Labor Party has stolen ahead on, that the Labor Party has moved with public opinion on as well. I think that is one of the big things that strikes me about Whitlam's record as opposition leader, is he not only makes the government jump to his own tune, but does so in a way that's quite constructive. And the comparison, I think, Frank, you might have made it, is with Tony Abbott, who's recently been invoked as the most successful opposition leader. And I'll just leave that there.
Well, yes, I think really much of today and the papers that Frank and I have put together are really reflecting on that very question, Eric, that question of Whitlam as a successful opposition leader, which I think Freudenberg said that is at least as successful in itself as the coming into government and the government itself. Because through this extraordinarily divisive period, Freudenberg said he taught the Labor Party how not to split, despite very nearly re-splitting on many occasions, and managed to keep the party together and to rebuild in this extraordinary platform. So I do think the period in opposition is a much more constructive one. And Frank, your article on this was very interesting, referring to Abbott, you know, in that sense, as a very successful opposition leader. However, there's another type of success, and that's one that sees opposition as a period of opportunity to rebuild, to regroup, to make a party relevant. And that's what makes the Labor Party, I think, resilient and enduring, and such a long-standing party, because it hasn't yet fallen over. Let's hope it continues in that way. But much of that is because of this difficult but ultimately constructive period in opposition.
And one reflection that I would make is one of the, utter challenges of being in opposition, which of course is where I am still right now, is relevance. We constantly struggle with irrelevance, particularly, at the state level. And so the relevant word in relevant and electable really does, I think, speak to the incredible achievement of Whitlam. It is not easy to make an opposition relevant. I will tell you that, and we really shouldn't undersell his achievement in that regard. We'll go here, and then Bruce, and then we'll keep the conversation going.
Thank you, Warren Gardner. I'm struck by, we have a lot about China and the significance of some of those things, which I don't discount. I'm a bit surprised we don't talk about cities much, because I would say between the 69 and 72 campaign, I've looked in the archives, the precious archives online. Whitlam was relentless. The things you looked at, Parramatta, to his great frustration, we never collected until he left Parliament. But he was constantly in Parramatta talking about cities. And I would say this, who knows what the survey said at the time, but I think if you asked a lot of people at that time, McMahon didn't get it. He didn't get it. There's so many statements, and there's Whitlam demolish feeble attempts by McMahon, who, as we know, McMahon himself, living in the eastern suburbs, did not even live in his own electorate, let alone have any familiarity with the challenges faced by people living in the suburbs. And I would remind people, we won Mitchell. We won Mitchell in 1972 because Whitlam had a campaign to which the Liberal Party had no answer. And so I think this is one of the things, and his advocacy on this issue is absolutely incredible. Thought a lot in a way, and McMahon wasn't the only one, of course, who in a way was joking about what's this about the Commonwealth government and cities, Of course, they're only in charge of migration and so many other things which entirely shape airports and so on, all those things that shape cities. But they didn't get it. But he could see forward. Now, I think in some ways, I have my views and the comment about Rudd government and various other things, and certainly the most recent coalition governments. That debate, as someone who's passionate about cities, that debate has gone far too far. We have the Commonwealth government funding things in cities which is ridiculous. But we have to say that from Whitlam, living in Cabramatta at that time and talking to people relentlessly and engaging with people, planners and so on, who were never, ever, up until that point, engaged in big political debates. Changed that dialogue, and that was an area where McMahon was completely exposed as all over the shop.
Any reflections? Interesting point.
Yeah, just the one that the Liberal Party, I talked about the fidelity of its faith to federalism. So many of the Liberal Party members elected, in particular in 1949 at the start, went in with an absolute horror of any kind of central government with a big role. And so changing the mindset around that and overcoming that was absolutely huge. And I think Gorton deserves a fair bit of the credit for pushing that. But of course, in doing so, he antagonised people left, right and centre. That's a time, I think, where the public had got ahead of the coalition. And so that's why that answer was A, so enfeebled, but B, so long in coming, so long delayed. September 1972 is when the Urban Regional Development Authority is established, 2 or 3 months out from the election. It's just, yeah.
Yeah, I'd just say that I agree, Warren, absolutely, that it's a really important, absolutely critical part of Whitlam's thinking. And in fact, his first speech to Parliament was very much centred on that need for people in the outer suburban areas. And as you say, he knew that, he was part of that. They'd built their own home, they'd experienced the shortages in building products and so on. And that was their milieu, their community, and very familiar with the lack of sewerage, the lack of roads, the fact that the trains didn't go all the way through, and the amenity issues and so on. And that's why the background is important. Whitlam's background is important to understand. This is the biographer speaking, but from that perspective, the childhood in Canberra, the developing national capital, the possibilities of a sort of more controlled environment meeting the needs of people in a new city were really stark to him. And yes, absolutely, that's a fundamental part of the campaign, and it's one that resonated really closely, I think, with voters, although I haven't seen the figures and maybe Murray could help us out there. But you know, it was a very domestic-oriented, clear set of policies that spoke to people as relevant.
We'll go Bruce and then Jeff, and we've only got sort of 10 minutes left, but you know, obviously the conversation is to continue throughout the day.
Look, just a couple of points. I don't want to open up the Kim Williams, Murray Goot argument again, but just to say that we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that Whitlam was elected with 49.5% of the primary vote in 1972. Albanese won with 32%. In this day and age where we have a proliferation of minor parties, some of which form governments, questions about mandates are more complex. But I think in 1972 there was no real question about the mandate of that government. It's the only way that you can test what you want to put into policy by announcing it and having it voted on. That's the only way we can do it. Just one other question, though, I'd have of Patrick, and it relates to William McMahon and John McEwen. There was always a lot of talk that McEwen blackballed McMahon after Holt's death, but then he did agree, I assume, to work with McMahon after he was elected. How did that play out internally in the coalition? Did it create more problems than they would have expected to have had in the past, you know, when Menzies and McEwen and others were calling the shots as a coalition?
So it definitely didn't work out very well. McEwen rescinded the veto in the aftermath of the 1969 election, knowing that he was going to retire. I think it's in February 1970 that he retires. It's pretty shortly afterward. And that was one of the big reasons why he said, basically, I don't have to work with him, so not my problem. The other thing that he said was that it was obviously a cruel injustice to deny the Liberals the opportunity to be led by the man with the most experience. And this is something I think is notable. McMahon, by that point, had 20 years as a minister. That's an extraordinarily long tenure. Doug Anthony disagreed with the decision to rescind the veto, and he said to me that he would have had enormous trouble if he had tried to reassert it in the lead up to 1971. If you look at, there are various documents and things you can look at though, and you can see that the relationship between the Country Party and the Liberal Party in this time was just of tremendous tension. As I said, the breakup of the coalition was broached at the end of 1971. There were constant talks of McMahon having a, quote, diplomatic illness and retiring in favour of Anthony. And I think it's also in the aftermath of the 1969 election when McEwen visited Hasluck, he is recorded saying and telling Gorton, pull your head in. If you don't act in consultation and talk with us, then we will have to do something. We might break apart. So that relationship was certainly fractious. But you can see those fractures going right back into the Menzies years. There are enormous fractures there.
Jeff Gallop?
Thank you very much to Jenny and also Patrick for their contribution. This difference between 69 and 72 is really quite a fascinating issue from a political point of view. 69, big swing, just didn't get there. 72, smaller swing, but obviously the numbers came in. I would like to put forward the proposition that what happened between 69 and 72. First of all, in 72, I think Gough Whitlam had a lot more spring in his step and just generally was very, very confident. And as people have said, optimism is a wonderful thing in politics. Now, why would have that been? Go back to 69, our good friends in Victoria, that is the ALP we're talking about. I don't know how to put this delicately, but they were pretty extreme. And the image they're setting out to the electorate wasn't the moderate social democratic sort of approach. It was quite different. Mr Hartley being one of the worst exports from WA to Victoria. So that hadn't been resolved. The other one was Vietnam. Gough didn't have the confidence on that issue that perhaps he had on a lot of others.
You might argue that his lack of confidence on the issue and his dilly-dallying around, which he did, there's no question he was dilly-dallying around that issue, might have been the right approach to deal with it politically. But certainly by 1969, when the movement out in the streets was developing and all of that, he was uncomfortable with that. And he didn't have a clear position. I'd have to say, people might disagree, I don't think he had, at that point, a clear position on it. And now I'm going to throw in the two developments, of course. China. I mean, what an incredible fillip to your self-confidence to do what he did there. And amazing anecdote here, I was president of the university branch of the Labor Party in WA, and we got Gough to come to the university directly after he'd been to China to speak, and he spoke on urban policy. and it was in the Winthrop Hall, it was packed. And it was a most brilliant speech about how we can change the way we live and to deal with the suburbs. It was unbelievable, and I totally agree that that was a real confidence maker and a builder of a little bit of an extra vote that came in 69 because he was so strong on it at that particular point. And secondly, Tom Burns and I think it was Mick Young, wasn't it, was sent down to Victoria. They took over. So he had a win there. The win in China was massive. And then I just think he was really confident. And then he was clearer on Vietnam. The troops are going to come out, we're going to end conscription, and his policy speech said that. So he gained clarity. So I'd just like the comments on what do you think, the key factors from 69 to 72? Because that is a very important issue. If he'd won in 69, I mean, I think life would have been a little bit better for the Whitlam program than it turned out because he won in 72. And having been a union organiser at that particular time, the recession and the economy was really coming in there as a big issue against the government.
Jenny, reflections, and then Patrick.
Well, basically, yes, I agree with all of the changes you're pointing to between 69 and 72. And, you know, to some extent, the positions, perhaps the popular positions had also cemented around the position that Whitlam had been putting in 69, so perhaps he was more confident of their reception. But definitely Victoria, I think, made a huge difference. You know, you can see that from the electoral figures. The state, you disagree? Won 3 seats in Victoria and lost 1. Yes, but there was a big difference between the vote.
Oh, the vote, but we're talking about
Victoria
seats for victory.
Yes,
Without
yes.
the victories in Victoria, he would have had a majority of 5 instead of 9.
Yeah, but I'm just saying that there was a big shift in the supporting Victoria between 69 and 72. Yeah. I mean, Whitlam always thought that he may well have won in 69. I don't know if the figures bear this out, but because the vote in the state of Victoria was so much lower than in other states for Labor. So no doubt it was a drag. And after the intervention, yes, there was a big difference. So I'm not saying he wouldn't have won without Victoria, but I'm just saying that cemented that, and it would have given him more confidence that he didn't have to deal with this thorn in his side anymore. So I think there's several things, but also, yes, the way in which public opinion had taken a much firmer hold around those key issues, Jeff, I think is absolutely key. And I just want to say how proud I am that my grandmother was one of those people marching in the moratorium.
Patrick, did you have any reflections on that?
Yeah, I'd just pull out a little bit. And one of the things that is striking me when I was reading through this whole thing was that the number of electoral tests that happened between 1966 and 72. You had 66 election where Labor obviously, ate the dust. But there was a half Senate election in 67. There's the election in 69. There's a half Senate election in 1970. And on each of those occasions, the government had a swing against it. So I think that constant electoral reaffirmation, perhaps, of Whitlam would have underscored some of that confidence, as well as the Phillips he gained from his by-election campaigning. Those two would have... I mean, plus also the Liberal Party leaders that he gained the ascendancy over in the House, Holt, Gorton, McMahon. Seeing 3 of them off, you can't feel bad about that. So, yeah.
We are almost out of time, and I'm getting the wrap up, but we've got a lady here, and we haven't had many questions from women. So let's hear it.
Hi, Carol.
Oh, okay, sorry. We have a question here, and the question, I'm getting the wrap up the back. I'm happy to keep the conversation going. We'll go here and then up the back and then here. We can keep talking.
Not so much.
Thanks so much. Charlie Joyce is my name. I was wondering if the panel had any thoughts with all these reflections on the importance of the 69 election. for the eventual victory in the 72 election, the 69 election. Obviously, the big swing fought on a comparatively small policy platform, the 72 big policy platform, the one that finally got them to government, but a smaller swing. Has that created a mythology that distorts our view of how change and how progressive government is won in Australia?
Yeah, interesting question. I don't think necessarily. I think each of them has, their own dynamics and their own needs. I mean, you could make an interesting argument, I think, about the previous election in this country and Labor expecting to come into office but not, and then succeeding with Albanese earlier this year. In some ways, it's a very different circumstance, but you might say there's elements of a two-election victory. But interestingly, Menadue and Race Matthews always said they anticipated that it would take two strong elections to come into office because, the dynamics of such a long-standing Conservative administration were just phenomenal and very, very difficult to overturn, not just in the community but in all of the sort of institutions that have become used to operating in that way and that really needed to rethink politics.
Patrick, did you know? Or we might just last comment or contribution here from Rodney, and lunch is ready to be eaten by us.
Thank you, Rose. In Jenny's printed paper, she talks about the Harradine affair bringing matters to a head, and Gough, being re-elected, was vested with the authority to effect change. I assert that is wholly wrong. Wholly wrong. The Harradine affair and the subsequent caucus ballot, Gough lost a vote. He was humiliated, and while Gough was never one to admit to humiliation, obviously the hard heads got to him and persuaded the course you're taking, Gough, is wrong. You might argue with that. What you can't argue is that he took a different course, a wise course. If he'd continued as he had in the week of the Harradine affair, there would have been a second challenge before 69 and it could well have been fatal. Gough's great achievement was in 67 at the Federal Conference, as it was then called, the 36 Faceless Men, when he persuaded the conference to bring on board the two parliamentary leaders. The left added the two Senate leaders, 4 extra leaders, and the 6 state leaders. So the Federal Conference went from 36 to 46 just like that, and later on the ACT. The importance of that is revealed when it comes to intervention in Victoria and New South Wales in 1970. The first 4 leaders elected were Gough and Lance, Lionel Murphy and Sam Cohen. Sam dies, he's replaced by Don Willisey. Instead of it being, as the left intended, 2 against 2, it became 3 pro-Whitlam, which is a more accurate way of putting it, and 1 against. That gap is all important in the intervention in Victoria in 1970. And it's certainly right that the big swing to Labor in the 1972 election is in Victoria. It's a remarkable swing. Labor went so close in so many others and consummated it in 74. The Harradine affair is important because Gough wakes up to himself. You have to go back and read the papers of the time, which I wish people would do. The Daily Telegraph and the Bulletin, under the ownership of Sir Frank Packer, was adamant that Labor had a simple solution to regain government: realign with the DLP, bring the DLP back into the fold. And there was a canard abroad, which Murray has heard about, and other people in this room, no doubt, that Gough wasn't really Labor and Gough was intending to collude with the DLP. Both falsehoods of the first rank, but a moment like the Harradine affair gave life to the canard.
Jenny, would you care to respond?
Well, I'll just say I don't necessarily disagree with anything you said, Rodney. And I do think Whitlam was chastened by that event. I think absolutely he was, by the Harradine affair, and particularly by, after his explosive resignation, particularly by how close that vote was. So, yes, in some ways that's a sort of movement out of those periods of constant split and division. And in my view, that's as much what he was furious about, was that he just couldn't retain the unity that he believed they needed to have to go into government and be taken seriously.
All right, well, look, we're going to have to wrap up there. I failed as a moderator to finish on time, although we're only a bit late. But I think I succeeded in that there was an excellent discussion around the room, some disagreement. I think that's a fabulous thing. Thank you so much to everyone for coming. Let's thank our panellists, wonderful Jenny Hocking and Patrick Mullins.